What if I told you that one of the richest cities on Earth sits at the heart of one of the most divided economies in the developed world? Because behind London's glittering skyline, the billion-dollar banks, the luxury penthouses, the Michelin-starred dinners, lies a country that feels broken. This is the United Kingdom, a nation once so powerful it ruled a quarter of the planet. Yet today, it's a country where life expectancy in some towns is lower than in Rwanda, where regions that built the Industrial Revolution are now among the poorest in Western Europe. London alone counts more than 200,000 millionaires and 45 billionaires. But just a few hours north, in places like Blackpool or Jaywick, families struggle to afford heating and basic health care. The gap is so wide that if you remove London from Britain's GDP, the rest of the country suddenly looks poorer than Mississippi. How did it come to this? How did the same island that once invented modern finance, shipbuilding, and global trade end up as a tale of two nations, one booming, the other left behind? The answer doesn't start with Brexit or globalization or the 2008 financial crisis. It begins much earlier, in 1979. That was the year a new kind of economic revolution began, one that promised efficiency, freedom, and prosperity, but ended up reshaping Britain into a divided kingdom, trapped inside what we now call the London Trap. To understand why Britain became a divided kingdom, we need to go back to the 1970s, a decade that nearly broke the country. At the start of that decade, Britain was still clinging to its industrial past. The coal mines, the shipyards, the steel mills. They were the pride of the working class and the backbone of the economy. But beneath that pride, something was rotting. Productivity was falling, inflation was soaring, and labor unions were powerful enough to shut the country down with a single strike. Then came the oil shock. In 1973, the OPEC crisis sent global oil prices up more than threefold. Britain, heavily dependent on imports, was hit hard. Prices for everything, food, fuel, housing, exploded. The value of the British pound collapsed. 100 pounds in 1970 was worth barely a third of that by 1979. It was a lost decade of chaos. The newspapers called it the sick man of Europe. Garbage piled up in the streets. The government literally ran out of money to keep the lights on. Strikes blacked out entire cities. Inflation hit 25%. For ordinary families, paychecks became meaningless from one month to the next. Then, in 1979, came Margaret Thatcher, a grocer's daughter from Grantham, determined to rewrite the rules of Britain's economy. She believed the country's sickness came from too much government control, too much spending, and too little discipline. Her answer was radical. Alongside her Chancellor Geoffrey Howe and advisors Keith Joseph and Alan Walters, Thatcher turned to a new economic faith, monetarism. If inflation was caused by too much money, she reasoned, the cure was to cut the supply, no matter the pain. Interest rates were raised to a record 17%. Government spending was slashed. Taxes were increased during a recession, a move economists warned could be disastrous. The money supply, measured by M3, was tightened from 12% growth down to 6%. And the pain came fast. Thousands of factories closed. The manufacturing heartlands of northern England collapsed almost overnight. Unemployment passed 2 million, the highest since the Great Depression. Entire communities were wiped out. Yes, inflation fell from 13% to 5%, and the government celebrated it as victory. But it was a hollow victory. Behind the numbers, Britain was breaking apart. 364 economists from across the country signed an open letter condemning Thatcher's policy as unsupported by theory and evidence. But she pressed on. There is no alternative, she said, a phrase that would define an era. Yet, what's often forgotten is that Thatcher's recovery wasn't purely homegrown. Around the same time, Britain struck gold. or rather oil, in the North Sea. Billions in new tax revenue began to flow into government coffers, cushioning the economic blow. It was a once-in-a-generation windfall. Without it, the so-called Thatcher miracle might never have existed. Still, the deeper cost was already set in motion. The new policies stabilized the pound and pleased the markets, but they gutted the industrial base that had sustained millions of working families for generations. Economically, it was a cure. Socially, it was poison. The patient, Britain, survived, but it would never be the same again. And that's where our story truly turns. Because what came next wasn't just recovery, it was transformation. London was about to rise higher than ever, while the rest of the country fell further behind. Everything changed in 1986. The world called it the Big Bang. By the early 1980s, Britain was living in two realities. In the north, factories stood silent, their chimneys no longer smoking, their gates chained shut. But in London, something very different was beginning to stir. While the working towns were still counting job losses, London's financial district, the City, was preparing for its biggest transformation in a century. The date was October 27, 1986. The world would remember it as the Big Bang. With a single set of reforms, the Thatcher government swept away decades of financial regulation. Currency controls were abolished. Commissions were deregulated. Foreign firms were allowed to buy British banks and trading houses. And a new technology, electronic trading, turned the old stock exchange floor into a network of flashing screens and rapid trades. Overnight, London was reborn. Money poured in from New York, Tokyo, and Zurich. In just a few years, foreign investment in the financial sector jumped by more than £400 million. The city minted more than 1,500 new millionaires. British GDP began to rise again, and for a moment, it looked like the country had finally escaped its old industrial ghosts. But the success was deceiving. The numbers went up, yet the benefits stayed put. London became richer, faster, and more global than ever before, while the rest of Britain was left standing still. By the late 1980s, the share of manufacturing in the economy had fallen from 30% to just 16%. Millions of industrial jobs vanished, not to automation, not to China, but to policy. Unemployment in northern England, Scotland, and Wales soared above 15%, while London's rate stayed below 10%. The nation's economic map was redrawn. One half of the country ran on finance and speculation. The other half was running out of hope. Economists describe this as a shift from production to services. But that word, services, hides a darker truth. Financial services create enormous value on paper, yet they don't spread that value very far. Studies later showed that for every job created in finance, only one additional job was generated elsewhere in the economy. In manufacturing, that multiplier had been 9. The result was predictable. London's glass towers rose higher, while the North's brick factories crumbled into dust. For some, this was a necessary evolution, Britain embracing its comparative advantage in finance, innovation, and global markets. But for millions of families outside the capital, it felt like betrayal. Their towns had powered the empire, fueled its railways, and built its ships. Now, they were being told they didn't matter anymore. By 1989, Britain's Inequality Index, the Gini coefficient, had risen from 25 to 35, a jump of more than 40% in less than a decade. No other major Western nation saw such a rapid widening of the gap. The political rhetoric spoke of efficiency and growth, but ordinary people saw boarded-up shops, shuttered factories, and empty streets. As one union leader put it, London has become a parasitic money engine. It feeds on the rest of us. And yet, even critics couldn't deny the city's global dominance. London was now the beating heart of world finance, a capital of capital. Every major bank wanted a foothold there. Every foreign investor wanted a piece of it. The lights of Canary Wharf became the new skyline of Britain, symbols of power, success, and modernity. But just beyond those glowing towers, entire regions were turning into economic wastelands. Britain had won its financial war, but lost its balance. And as the 1990s approached, a new obsession would take hold: property. The nation that once built ships and engines would soon start building wealth from bricks and mortgages instead. Everything was about to be owned and sold. After the Big Bang, money in Britain found a new obsession: property. The factories were gone, the jobs were gone, but the dream of ownership was still alive. And that dream had a name: right to buy. Introduced in 1980, the policy was Margaret Thatcher's proudest achievement. For the first time, millions of working-class families could buy the council homes they had rented for decades, often at discounts of 30 to 70% with no deposit required. It sounded revolutionary. The state was shrinking, people were gaining assets, and Britain was becoming a property-owning democracy. For many, it was a moment of empowerment. Families that had never owned anything suddenly held deeds to their homes. Overnight, working-class Britons became homeowners, proud, independent, self-reliant. But what looked like freedom soon became the foundation of a crisis. Over the next 2 decades, local governments were banned from using the money they earned from selling those homes to build new ones. The result was predictable. As people bought, the stock of affordable housing collapsed. London alone lost over 60% of its public housing. Across the country, 40% of those former council homes ended up back in the private rental market, owned by landlords, not families. What had begun as an act of liberation turned into a slow-motion privatization. Housing didn't just become a necessity, it became an industry. By the 1990s, owning property was no longer about shelter, it was about profit. The city's money, fresh from the financial boom of the 1980s, poured into real estate. House prices started to climb, then accelerate, then explode. In London, prices doubled compared to the national average. The capital became a magnet for global wealth, from Russian oligarchs to Gulf investors, from Hong Kong tycoons to American hedge funds. By early 2024, nearly 27% of property transactions in London involved foreign buyers. For comparison, in New York, that figure is just 0.3%. The reasons weren't hard to see. Britain's tax laws were extraordinarily generous to outsiders. The non-dom status allowed wealthy foreign residents to shelter overseas income from UK taxes. Property became the perfect vault, a safe haven from money that didn't want to be found. Billions of pounds flowed through anonymous shell companies and offshore trusts, quietly reshaping London's skyline and pricing out its own residents. Meanwhile, the average worker faced a different reality. Home ownership rates began to fall for the first time in decades. Renters spent more of their income just to stay housed. By the early 2000s, the average London home cost more than 10 times the median annual salary, and the social cost grew darker. Homelessness surged. By 2024, around 13,000 people in London were officially recorded as homeless, a 63% increase in just 10 years. Broaden the definition to include those in temporary or unstable housing, and roughly 2% of London's population fits the category. Yet, government after government, conservative or Labour, refused to reverse course. The ideology of ownership had become sacred. Property was wealth, and wealth was success. Even as new generations found themselves locked out of the market, Britain doubled down on the same model: easy credit, scarce supply, and ever-rising prices. Economically, this strategy worked for a while. Rising property values fueled consumer confidence and spending. Homeowners borrowed against their houses to buy cars, vacations, and more homes. It was a feedback loop of illusionary prosperity. But underneath, inequality was hardening into something structural. The divide was no longer just between North and South. It was between those who owned and those who didn't. Housing, once a social foundation, had become the new industrial complex, a machine for concentrating wealth. As one economist later put it, Britain stopped making things and started making housing bubbles. The country had replaced factories with mortgages and production with speculation. By the time the 2008 financial crisis hit, Britain's fate was sealed. When the housing market crashed, the shock was felt everywhere, except, of course, in London's luxury postcodes, where global money continued to pour in. The rest of the country, meanwhile, was left picking up the pieces. The empire that once built ships and railways was now building equity, and even that was running out. Next came a decade of cuts, stagnation, and political upheaval. The promise of shared prosperity was gone, and in its place came the illusion of leveling up. By the 2010s, Britain was supposed to have learned its lesson. After decades of boom and bust cycles, widening inequality, and financial crashes, the country promised to rebuild itself, fairer, smarter, and more balanced. But that promise never really happened. Instead, Britain entered what many economists now call a post-industrial but not post-inequality era. The mines were gone, the mills were gone, the factories were gone, but the divides they left behind had only deepened. Nowhere was that clearer than in investment, the lifeblood of any economy. Each year, London received roughly £1,200 per person in infrastructure spending. In the Northeast, that figure was just £430. In the East Midlands, barely £350. If the government had invested evenly across the country, Britain would have poured an extra £140 billion into regional transport, enough to build 7 Elizabeth lines, those sleek, high-speed trains that now crisscross London. But outside the capital, trains still crawled along Victorian tracks. Buses ran once an hour. In some towns, they stopped running altogether after 6 p.m. For millions, commuting even 30 miles for work meant a 2-hour ordeal. The message was clear. London moved fast. The rest of the country waited. And it wasn't just infrastructure. Research and innovation, the foundation of future growth, followed the same pattern. London and the South East received about £60 per person in R&D funding. The North got 21, the Midlands just 14. This created a feedback loop, a self-reinforcing trap. The regions with the most investment became more productive, which justified more investment, which made them even more productive. Meanwhile, struggling areas were told they lacked the capacity to absorb funding, a polite way of saying they were too poor to be helped. Germany, by contrast, does the opposite. Its federal model channels more resources into weaker regions, building universities, transport networks, and innovation hubs far from Berlin. The result? Smaller gaps, stronger balance, and far less resentment. In Britain, resentment was becoming a national currency. Then came austerity. From 2010 to 2015, the government slashed public spending to reduce deficits after the financial crisis. But those cuts fell hardest on local councils, especially outside London. Libraries closed, youth centers disappeared. Local transport and welfare services were gutted. For many towns, austerity wasn't an abstract fiscal adjustment. It was the quiet dismantling of their last safety nets. And just as those wounds began to scar, Brexit tore them open again. In 2016, millions voted to leave the European Union, many from the very regions that had been left behind. They wanted change, they wanted control. What they got instead was another economic shock. By the early 2020s, trade with the EU had fallen by roughly $100 billion a year. Exporters faced new paperwork, tariffs, and border delays. Productivity growth, already stagnant since 2008, flatlined completely. The UK became the only major economy where output per worker barely grew for an entire decade. To fix this, politicians launched a new slogan, leveling up. It sounded bold, a mission to spread opportunity beyond London. But behind the glossy branding, the reality was thin. Many of the projects were short-term grants, photo-op announcements, or repackaged funds that had already existed. Even some of the civil servants tasked with delivering it admitted privately, leveling up was designed to fail. Supporters pointed to cities like Manchester as proof of success, a place of rising skyscrapers and tech firms. And yes, Manchester has grown, but dig deeper and you'll see that much of that growth still relies on London money, London capital, and London policies. The deeper problem isn't that Britain stopped investing, it's that it keeps investing in the same place. A Harvard study found that the UK is one of the only advanced economies where city size does not correlate with productivity. In Germany, Italy, or France, mid-sized cities thrive. In Britain, they stagnate. The reason? Infrastructure that isolates, housing costs that trap, and a planning culture, NIMBYism, that prevents new growth almost anywhere outside the capital. It's as if Britain built a system designed to funnel everything, talent, money, innovation, back toward London. 4 decades after Thatcher's reforms, the circle had completed itself. The industrial heartlands that once powered the empire now rely on public subsidies. The financial capital that promised prosperity has become an engine of inequality. The United Kingdom had become, in every sense, unbalanced, a nation tilting toward its capital, waiting for a future that never seems to arrive. And as the 2020s unfolded, with energy crises, stagnant wages, and political paralysis, the question returned, sharper than ever. Can a country this divided ever truly grow again? Or has Britain trapped itself in the gravitational pull of its own capital, the London trap? Tony Blair once said, "The kaleidoscope has been shaken. The pieces are in flux, but it has settled around London." And that, in many ways, captures Britain's modern story. A country that once ruled the world now revolves around one city. London still dines at Michelin tables while the rest of the nation fights over crumbs. But the problem isn't just economic, it's structural, built into the country's geography, politics, and even psychology. For decades, Britain has measured success by the glow of its capital, not by the strength of its regions. The empire may be gone, but the imperial mindset remains. Everything must flow to the center. Yet Britain is not poor, it is misaligned. The resources, the talent, the innovation, they still exist. They're simply concentrated in one place. There is another path. It starts with investing outward instead of upward, channeling capital into green industries, regional banks, and local infrastructure. It means funding universities and R&D hubs beyond London, empowering cities like Newcastle, Sheffield, and Bristol to compete on their own terms. It means rebuilding trust, not through slogans, but through shared opportunity. Because a country's strength isn't measured by the height of its skyscrapers, but by how far its prosperity can reach. A nation can lose its empire. It can lose its industry. It can even lose its pride. But if it learns to share its prosperity, it can still find its future.